All right, so we're back for another deep dive, and this one is going to be pretty interesting.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking about President-elect Trump's pick for Director of National Intelligence,
Okay.
Tulsi Gabbard.
Interesting choice.
For those who might not remember, she was a congresswoman and ran for president in 2020.
Right.
And she's got some pretty strong opinions that have caused a lot of controversy over the years. So
Definitely.
the big question here is what happens when you give the keys to the nation's top secret intel to someone who's known for shaking things up?
Well, it's certainly a fascinating pick.
Yeah.
And it's going to lead to a lot of debate and discussion, especially when you consider Gabbard's views on Russia.
Yeah, absolutely. Her background is interesting too, right? I mean, she's a military veteran, a former Democratic congresswoman from Hawaii,
Uh-huh.
even ran for president in 2020, and then in 2022 she became an independent and very publicly criticized the Democratic Party, even calling them warmongers and woke ideologues.
Yeah, pretty dramatic shift.
Huge, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah. And that journey from Democrat to independent, I think, is key to understanding why this appointment is causing such a stir.
Okay, so let's talk about that a little.
So initially, Gabbard was actually pretty popular within the Democratic Party because of her progressive stances on issues like healthcare and climate change.
And
Then things kind of took a turn. Her views, especially when it came to foreign policy, started to align more with conservative viewpoints.
What specifically comes to mind?
Well, you've got her stance on the war in Ukraine.
Oh, yeah.
Back in 2022. She endorsed the Russian justification for the invasion. Their claim that the U.S. was funding biolabs in Ukraine to make bioweapons.
Yeah, I remember that. I was like, wait, what? When I first heard that.
That's where things get kind of messy because in reality, these biolabs are actually part of a global effort to control outbreaks.
Okay.
The World Health Organization works with countries all over the world, including Ukraine, to make sure dangerous pathogens are handled safely.
So to prevent pandemics? Exactly.
It's not about making bioweapons. It's about protecting everyone.
Okay, so essentially Gabbard was just repeating Russian propaganda.
Pretty much. Yeah.
And that's pretty concerning, right? Especially with everything going on with the war.
Very much so.
This article from the AP even mentions that Russian state TV praised her comments.
Yeah, I saw that.
Which raises questions about, her potential alignment with Russian interests.
Absolutely. And then you have to think about what it means for her to hold these views while potentially running U.S. intelligence.
Yeah, what does that even look like?
Think about the impact on sharing intel with our allies.
Okay.
Potential bias in how we analyze intelligence.
Right.
And even how it could shift U.S. policy decisions related to Russia and Ukraine.
It's a lot to consider.
A lot to unpack.
Definitely. And then on top of all of that, there's her stance on U.S. assistance to Ukraine.
Right.
She's been very vocal about criticizing Zelenskyy and suggesting that maybe if we acknowledge Russia's security concerns, this war could have been prevented.
Yeah, which raises the question, how can someone who believes that effectively lead U.S. intelligence?
Especially when it comes to supporting Ukraine and dealing with Russia.
Exactly. It's a tough situation.
Yeah, very delicate balance, and a lot of people are worried.
Definitely.
And then there's the whole thing with her 2017 meeting with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
So Assad is obviously a close ally of Russia.
Right.
And he's been accused of war crimes. The U.S. has cut off diplomatic ties with Syria.
Yeah.
So her meeting with him definitely raised some eyebrows.
It did. That meeting with Assad, given how close he is to Russia, is a potential conflict of interest.
Yeah.
And it makes you question her judgment, especially on matters of national security in the Middle East.
Absolutely.
Like, how would this past relationship affect her decisions if she's the one in charge of U.S. intelligence?
It's like this whole web of relationships and allegiances, and Gabbard is right in the middle of it all.
It really is.
This adds another layer of complexity to an already tense geopolitical landscape.
Absolutely. And it highlights the tricky balance the U.S. has to maintain in its dealings with Russia.
Especially considering the war in Ukraine.
Exactly.
So what does all this mean for the future? What could happen if she actually becomes the Director of National Intelligence?
Well, it could make things even worse with our allies.
Yeah.
A lot of them are already worried about Russia.
Right.
So imagine you're a European leader.
Uh-huh.
Would you really feel good about sharing your intelligence?
Oh, that's a good point.
If you weren't sure about the U.S. intelligence leadership.
Yeah, it creates a real trust problem.
Huge trust issue.
And then what if our allies don't want to share information anymore?
Exactly.
Wouldn't that hurt cooperation on important security issues?
Big time. And we can't forget about how this might affect U.S. foreign policy.
Right. How so?
Well, Gabbard's been pretty outspoken about U.S. interventionism.
Yeah.
She thinks it causes more problems than it solves.
So she wouldn't want to get involved in other countries' affairs.
Right. So if she's in charge of intelligence, maybe U.S. foreign policy becomes more isolationist, less willing to get involved in conflicts, even when U.S. interests are at stake.
But wouldn't a less interventionist approach be a good thing?
It sounds good on the surface, right?
Yeah, like preventing future conflicts.
It's complicated, though.
Okay.
Reducing military action might seem appealing,
Sure.
but it could also be risky.
How so?
Well, it might make countries like Russia and China bolder.
Oh, I see what you mean.
They could see us holding back as weakness and take advantage.
So it's about finding that right balance.
Exactly.
You don't want to get involved in conflicts. We don't need to.
Right.
But we also need to protect ourselves and our allies.
Absolutely. And there's another layer to this.
Okay.
Remember we were talking about Gabbard having access to intelligence?
Yeah.
Well, there are different levels of security clearance. You know, each level lets you see more and more sensitive information.
Okay.
The Director of National Intelligence has access to everything.
Wow. So she'd see all the top secret stuff.
Everything, the nation's most closely guarded secrets.
And that's kind of scary considering some of the things she said and the people she's been involved with.
It's definitely a concern. Senator Elizabeth Warren has even said she's worried about Gabbard having access to that kind of information.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. And those concerns aren't just from Democrats either.
Right. Even during the Trump administration, some of our allies were worried about sharing intelligence.
So imagine how much worse that could get with Gabbard in charge.
Exactly. Some people even think this is a win for Russia.
Wow.
Which could have huge consequences for U.S. intelligence and our relationships with other countries.
So it sounds like Gabbard's leadership could really change the way U.S. intelligence works and interacts with the world.
It's definitely possible. But it's important to remember she's not operating in a vacuum.
Okay.
There are checks and balances, you know, and Congress keeps an eye on things too.
Right. So even if she tries to push her own agenda,
she's going to run into some roadblocks.
So it's not a guarantee that U.S. intelligence and foreign policy will totally change under her leadership.
Not necessarily. It's more likely that we'll see things adjust.
Okay.
Maybe even some tension as she figures out her role and works with the people already there.
Yeah, I can see that.
But there's definitely a chance for big changes both here and in other countries.
So we need to pay close attention and see how things play out.
It's a situation that needs to be carefully watched and analyzed.
Definitely, this deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
It has.
Gabbard's appointment could really shake things up, but we still don't know for sure what'll happen.
It's true. And this situation really makes us think about some important questions.
Like what?
The role of intelligence in a democracy.
Okay.
The importance of transparency and accountability. And how important it is to have checks and balances.
Right. And, you know, before we finish up, I want to leave our listeners with something to consider.
Okay, what's that?
We've talked about how Gabbard's appointment might affect U.S. intelligence and foreign policy. But what about something even bigger?
Like what?
Like the very foundation of American democracy.
Okay, I'm listening.
Think about it. We live in a time when people don't trust institutions as much.
Right.
There's a lot of misinformation out there.
Yeah.
And politics is more divided than ever.
Definitely.
And now we might have someone leading our intelligence who's been accused of spreading Russian propaganda and meeting with a dictator accused of war crimes.
I see where you're going with this.
It makes you worry about whether people will trust the government even less.
It does.
Not just the intelligence community, but the whole system.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Because if people don't believe the government can get information and analyze it objectively, it weakens the whole idea of a functioning democracy.
Right.
Because in a democracy, people need to be informed to make good decisions.
Exactly. You've raised a really important point.
I think so.
This whole situation shows how crucial it is to have transparency and accountability.
Absolutely.
Especially in places like the intelligence community.
And that's something we as citizens need to demand from our leaders.
Agreed.
No matter what political party they belong to.
It's about holding them responsible for what they do and the decisions they make.
We need to stay informed and engaged and hold them accountable.
I couldn't agree more. We can't just sit back and watch.
Right.
We have to be active in figuring out what's true for ourselves.
We can't just accept whatever information we're given.
Especially with all the information overload and political spin these days.
We have to be like our own intelligence analysts.
Oh, yeah.
You know, sifting through all the noise to find the truth.
It's a great analogy. We all have a responsibility to stay informed and be engaged citizens.
Absolutely, especially when it comes to things like national security and the future of our democracy.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This deep dive has really been something else.
It has.
We've talked about the ins and outs of Tulsi Gabbard's appointment as Director of National Intelligence.
Right, all the potential consequences.
Exactly. But it feels like this story's just getting started.
Yeah, like the first chapter.
For sure, it makes you think about the balance between national security, individual liberties, and a healthy democracy.
It does.
We're going to keep an eye on the situation, analyze what happens, and give you the information you need to understand it all.
Because at the end of the day, knowledge is power.
Absolutely, and an informed citizenry is the best defense against tyranny.
Well said to our listeners out there. Stay curious, stay engaged, and stay tuned for more deep dives into the most important issues of our time.
We'll be here.
This has been a fascinating and honestly kind of unsettling deep dive.
It has.
But as always, it's important to keep those minds sharp.